All my loving.
That is what it sounded like 50 years ago today, right here in Washington, D.C. That is actual recording of the Beatles' very first concert. They chose our town to come here first for their American concert, and we're celebrating all morning long. In fact, coming up at 8:05, James Rosen from Fox News will be in studio here. He's a Beatles aficionado. And then at 8:35, a real special treat, Peter Noon of Herman's Hermits. He was part of that British invasion. Also, at 7:35, Representative Andy Harris, Republican of Maryland, will ask him about the latest news on Obamacare, President lifting the mandate. By the way, if you want to enjoy any of the special Beatles programming we're doing today, go to WMAL.com. We've got a special page set up for it. I am Larry O'Connor alongside Brian Wilson.
We are joined by Mike Love of the Beach Boys. You know, Mike, I can only imagine what it was like. You know, you guys have already on the music scene. You put out Surfing Safari. You're having some success. And then one night, perhaps you happen to notice these creatures called the Beatles show up on the Ed Sullivan Show. What were you thinking at that time?
You know, we've always been fascinated by the Beatles and their particular brand of creativity, which is multifaceted, what with the John Lennon contribution and the George Harrison contribution, in addition to Paul McCartney, nobody's been more prolific than he. And then, of course, Ringo brings his personality and his talents to bear. And so, they're a really phenomenal group, and nobody's been more successful in pop music, I don't think. Maybe Michael Jackson approached that, but in terms of longevity and appeal of their music, are right up there.
But you know, you guys brought a new sound, the California surf sound, to the music scene, and then of course, when the Beatles come in 50 years ago, they bring their unique sound. But in many ways, because of the close harmonies and the really unique sound of the music that people hadn't really heard performed that way before, you had a lot of similarities, didn't you? How did you influence each other from that point forward?
Well, you know what? There was some influence. It was a competition, but it was a friendly rivalry. It wasn't like there was no negativity involved at all. But it's interesting to note that the inspiration for both the Beatles and the Beach Boys were quite similar. One is Chuck Berry was a great writer, and Paul McCartney said stuff about he's the best, And the Everly Brothers, Phil just passed away, but the Everly Brothers are a big deal for the Beatles and the Beach Boys. And you talk about harmonies and blend. Of course, with the Beach Boys, there was the Four Freshmen influence and gospel church music, and the doo-wop stuff that we grew up to in the U.S. That influenced us greatly. I don't think the doo-wop influenced the Beatles as much, but they had a lot of soul music influence as well. But so there were a lot of similarities in what gave rise to both the Beatles and the Beach Boys. And then further on, as we start making our own records, the Beatles did rock and roll music, and so did we. In fact, in 1976, I think our version of rock and roll music on our 15 Big Ones album, it was 15th anniversary, went top 5, which is pretty good,
Yeah.
So there was a lot of similarity in influences, and there was a lot of competition in a good way that resulted in some tremendous it was like in the arms race.
Right, yeah. And the technology advanced, and you've both decided to land on the moon.
Well, let me ask you the question. Obviously, the Beatles were very fond of of the Beach Boys as well. I mean, when you listen to Back in the USSR, that's a tribute to the Beach Boys, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I was sitting in India at Maharishi's place when Paul McCartney came to the breakfast table saying, "Hey, listen to this, Mike," and he played the verse of "Flew in from Miami Beach, BOAC." He played the Back in the USSR, and I said, "Paul, what you got to do is talk about all the girls around Russia in the middle part." And so the Ukraine girls and Georgia on my mind and all that. So that was pretty cool because it was absolutely obvious. Me being there in India with the rest of the Beatles, number one, it was enormously fascinating, a tremendous life-changing experience for me and for a lot of us. But it was interesting that Paul would come up with something that was sort of like quasi Beach Boys.
Yeah, you guys got a writing credit on that, right, for that suggestion? Yeah, not so much. Let me ask you, today we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Beatles doing their first American concert here in Washington, D.C.,
right.
And we hear some of the audio, the bootleg audio, and it's deafening, the screams of those girls. I mean, you can barely even hear the music. I wonder, from that point forward, when you started touring and doing concerts, did the audience reaction to you change? Did you start getting this crazy screaming going on as well?
Well, we had the same thing with our young fans. Like, we did a live album in Sacramento, California, at the Sacramento Memorial Auditorium. Same thing. At that point in time, the youth of the audience and the girls, it was Beatlemania, Beach Boys mania. It was the same thing. We used to have parades from the radio station. The radio station would organize to go from the airport into town. So there was a real excitement because rock and roll was relatively new, but I think the Beach Boys were the first boys group, and the Beatles were the second, and then the Stones, and then I like to say all hell broke loose.
Yeah. So you got to witness what it was like to be in America when the British invasion came here.
Oh yeah.
But there's also another side to that story. You got to take the American invasion to Great Britain.
Oh, yeah. In 1966, Good Vibrations went to number one, and we were voted the number one group in England, number two being the Beatles, number three the Stones. So, yeah, we did incredibly well in light of the overwhelming popularity of the Beatles at the time. And to take nothing away from them, they're phenomenal and have always been. But it was great. You know, I mean, Good Vibrations was an amazing song. I co-wrote it with my cousin Brian Wilson, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there was a tremendous rivalry, but in a good way.
All right. Well, Mike Love, it's such a pleasure to have you to talk on of your remembrances of the Beatles as we commemorate the 50th anniversary of their first concert in the United States. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you guys for showing up to our concerts and
we're big fans.
Turning your girlfriends and your kids on to the music that we'll still enjoy and we still love performing.
I tell you what, it still holds up, buddy.
You see them wearing their baggies, Warachi sandals too, a bushy blonde hairdo.